if you think about Led Zeppelin as kind of being one of the jumping off points for what hard rock and heavy metal sort of, I think if you ask a lot of heavy metal guys who their band is, Zeppelin is kind of the gateway to that. And early Zeppelin is very much aligned with very hard electric blues that was happening. So for me, the correlation between someone like a Howling Wolf would be, it's a small step from someone like that who was playing a very aggressive form of electric blues to where you're talking about early Led Zeppelin. They were the guys that took it, made it harder, made it louder. The amps were bigger, but in essence, the sound was still American blues music. If you start looking at the solos that those guys are playing and the construct of what they're doing, there's something called a blues scale, which is a flat 3 and a flat 5 of the chord progression. Which, if you hear anyone from Stevie Ray Vaughan, Muddy Waters to B.B. King, there is that pentatonic sound of that scale, which is in essence what blues is. The notes that make up what you would, anyone, my dad or my grandmother, would hear a note and go, well, that sounds bluesy, and that is that essence. So when those guys start to shred, they are still in that box of that pentatonic world that is in essence the blues scale and the foundation of blues music. If you're talking about rock, regardless of what stage of rock music you're talking about, whether it's the early days of Chuck Berry or whether you're talking about Metallica and everything that happened in between there, blues is the foundation of that music in every way. So for me, blues is the foundation of jazz. Blues is the foundation of rock. Western music comes from blues, and it comes from those chord structures, that rhythm, and in a lot of ways lyrically, the things they were touching on with blues are what a lot of the lyrics of a lot of hard rock and music came after that. So I would think you cannot have hard rock without blues. It's a no-brainer. It's a long way from Led Zeppelin to Yngwie Malmsteen, which is, I think, which is pretty much a very a Paganini approach to playing guitar, where you have stripped out a lot of the blues and you've kind of made it so technique heavy that you're almost in a classical violin world. I always think about a band like Rush in some ways is this kind of middle point between American heavy metal and what British kind of hard rock was, with more of that classical influence, and that location of sort of Toronto being halfway between the Mississippi and London is kind of why they have their own kind of unique blend of classical or progressive British music, and still a lot of sort of Zeppelin influences in there. And again, once you're at Zeppelin, you're very close to what I think is blues-based music. But I would agree, the music does take offshoots into different places that makes it further away from the core of blues, but all music takes those roads and starts to gather up other influences and moves in different directions. People are, I think, less invested in having the music that they hear being created by human beings that are talented. That seemed to be, when I was growing up, that was the most important component, was how good is the band? Can the band play live? Can that guy sing? Can that guy play guitar? How good is that drummer? Those things were very important qualities for me as a listener to make me want to enjoy the music that was being played. That seems to be something now that people are less invested in. They don't really care if someone is playing that drum part or whether a computer is generating it. They don't care if the person they're seeing, the performer, wrote that song or whether a team of people wrote that song. So I would say that there's an evolution with the public, which is in some ways disheartening, because the music I love is all generated by musicians who are usually who are unique and have had to practice and have had to, work really hard to get where they're going with their music. So sometimes I feel like you can't stop progress. I think there will always be an audience for people that for musicians that play good music, but whether or not, as we move forward, whether or not that will resonate with the general public in a giant way, it seems to be moving in a different direction.
What are your thoughts on the internet and how it's changed the record industry?
I think the worst part of it is it's devalued music. It's made music seem like it's worthless because you can get something for free. As that perpetuates itself over a long period of time, people just have an assumption that it has no value, it has no worth other than hitting a button and having it play for you. So I think more than anything, I want musicians to find different ways to get paid, and that's a really big factor in the fact that records aren't selling anymore. But I also think it's led to this slow motion, this movement that we talked about a little while ago about how people are less invested in the musicians that are making their music, less willing to support that financially because they don't feel it has worth. So I think when the internet came along and everything was there in front of me, I thought this was the most amazing thing that ever happened. Now, as we're 10, 15 years away from it being there, it feels like it's an all-you-can-eat buffet, and I'm getting full and I'm getting tired of eating. I still look for gatekeepers and people and filters as opposed to just this big wild west of a big blob of stuff out there that it's my responsibility to look through. I used to like reading Rolling Stone and Cream and having those folks have already filtered through some of the music that maybe they think is of value. So there's a lot of good side, bad side. The horse has already left the barn, so it is what it is. But I think the devaluing of music and making it seem like if we want it, it should be there for us regardless of cost is a real tragedy of something that's happened over the last 20 years.
There's a fellow named Lonnie Johnson, and he's largely forgotten today, but he lived and died in Toronto. There was a fellow named Lonnie Donegan who kind of invented skiffle music in Britain and was the biggest influence on the Beatles. His real name wasn't Lonnie, but he changed it to Lonnie after he met Lonnie Johnson, who toured in Britain in the early 60s, late 50s. And that's when Lonnie Donegan invented skiffle music, which influenced everybody from the Beatles on down. Lonnie Johnson also was a huge influence on jazz and in blues. So you take it back to Lonnie Johnson, you come forward to people like Eddie Lang, T-Bone Walker, Charlie Christian, Wes Montgomery, B.B. King, and everybody that followed. And of course that means Eric Clapton and all of the folks that followed him. Lonnie Johnson is the wellspring of all that. He's the guy that's been forgotten. Even Robert Johnson, the guy who sold his soul to the devil, copied Lonnie Johnson. Without Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, for instance, Led Zeppelin wouldn't have had some of their biggest hits. The Rolling Stones might not have had not only their hits, but the name of their band. The Rolling Stones came from a song that was popular from Muddy Waters, his song, Rolling Stone. Their song, Satisfaction, was basically a reworking of his theme, I Can't Be Satisfied. They called it Satisfaction. Rock came out of the blues. It came directly out of the blues. They didn't credit always the songwriters of the blues and the blues songwriters themselves, even Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. They got it from an earlier tradition. But there's no doubt that rock music, especially heavy rock, so-called, came out of the blues. The single most influential UK guitarist that people don't often speak about, but really should, is Hank B. Marvin of the group The Shadows. He was the guy that made them all want to get a red Stratocaster, the most melodic sound. There was a time when in the movie business and in the music business, there were big studios, big labels, and those people developed an artist. Today, there's no chance for that. When we were kids, I mean, my generation, to quote Pete Townsend, we passed into adulthood through music by actually buying a physical piece of plastic with the music on it. And we valued that. And we realized that this was like a right of being an adult, having your own music. Today, we don't have that opportunity. Well, that might be a good thing because there's maybe less pollution when you just buy everything electronically. But when nobody's buying anything, it goes back to the artist. They can't make any money because they're not selling anything. You can't make a living doing it, then you don't have the option to really get better at it. I believe it's important for musicians and for all of us to not just look specifically at our own little niche, but to look at what's happening in the wider realm of things, whether you're a photographer or even a travel agent or a newspaper writer. All of these forms of business or art are being weakened by the fact that nobody's paying for the services. Things are breaking down in a very unpredictable way. And I do believe that the quality of artists suffers. Not the quality of music, because my goodness, there are so many wonderful independent musicians all over the internet and everywhere. It's really important, though, to look outside of music for where music is going, as well as inside, just like anything.
Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, many of the pioneers of classic rock were heavily influenced by American blues. What are your thoughts on that?
Many of those artists who I think of as being the ones with the strongest amount of integrity would be the ones who always made sure that they mentioned where they were, how they were influenced, where the music came from, that they sat for hours on the floor, maybe cross-legged, listening to stacks of albums of music that they had heard older members of the family playing. And these would have been some of the rawest blues music albums and some of the early Motown music and soul and that kind of stuff. And when you listen to the early versions of what a lot of these artists were doing, whether it was the British invasion artists or the American white artists as well, you can hear that there were attempts to mimic. And then what nicely happened was that as that developed, you got kind of a hybrid. So you got something that was purely their own. And that being purely their own is I think I could safely say that's what became rock music, and that's what became classic rock. I think when people point at what classic rock is, it's right at that point where there was a slight change away from mimicking what had been heard and what was sort of the tradition to becoming something that was completely owned by the artists of the time. The blues is not really about being virtuosic. The blues is about the soul of the music. I think you're looking at a sensibility and also an understanding of the community. You'll hear a lot of rock artists talk about their respect for the blues traditions, the early blues music, the early American musics. And I think it's more than simply just the technique that they're playing. You mentioned the pentatonic scale. I think it's a little bit more than that. Everybody sort of learns that when they're first doing blues music. But I think it also becomes a sense of what the blues is expressing. And if you listen, let's say Clapton, for example, if you listen to the music of Clapton, as it expanded further on, as he progressed through the timeline, his music became more and more about Clapton and less about trying to be as close to the blues as possible. So that the music became Clapton's blues and not just American blues in that sensibility. The voice as well. The voice is also an instrument. So when you're listening to rock music, you listen to the lead singers of rock bands. Their voices are really exploring the extremes of the vocal of the voice's ability. The same way that blues music was exploring the same. So you'll hear people like some of the early blues musicians who are doing things that sound like guttural screams and the groans and sort of the bending of the tones themselves with their voices. You hear that in rock music as well. It's the kind of stuff that made your parents ask you whether or not there was something wrong with that singer when they were performing. But that's an expression of what you're trying to get across in the telling of the story of the music itself. If anything was the influence straight from blues into rock music, it was the telling of the story and the independence of that away from any sort of structure or rules.
Several of the musicians I've spoken to have said that musicians should make music primarily for themselves.
In jazz music, and in what we call classic rock music now, you have this thing about the artists themselves wanting to hone their skills. And they're doing that for their bandmates, they're doing it for themselves, they're challenging themselves with how much further into the music they can go, or how much more virtuosic they can be, or their improvisation skills, which is another thing that really ties the two musics together. But they're doing that for themselves and they're doing it for their bandmates. This is not something that where, they're working stuff out and they go, oh man, wait till I get on stage and I play this. The fans are going to go nuts. This isn't for the fans. This is for the musicians themselves. It's an artist thing. When they get out on stage, their fans love that because I think they're feeling that sense of the artist pushing themselves to be the greatest that they are. But it's not being the greatest they are for them. So it's an interesting relationship. And I think if you talk to a lot of musicians that way, they'll say the same thing. In their practice, in their performance, it's not about I do this for my audience, man. It's not that kind of stuff at all. This is, I'm doing this for me. I'm going to get really good at what it is that I'm doing, whether you're a keyboard player or a drummer. And then the audience picks up on that. The same thing happened in jazz through all of the different styles, from bebop to cool. People were really into what the sound was being created by this group of artists on stage. Not that the artists were doing it for them. How would you know anyway? as a person who's in the audience. You know, any of those stadium bands, you go there going, I know they're doing this for me, man. That's why I'm here. That's not how it works. That's not it at all. You're going because you want to hear this person who's challenged themselves to be the best that they can possibly be, not for you, but for them. There's a generation of people who were playing classic rock who would have been in their teens and 20s through the late 60s, in the 70s, early 80s, who couldn't help hearing the music that their older siblings, let's say, were listening to, or even their parents or their grandparents. This is the heyday of the LP. So you've got the LP and the 45, and they're listening to you know, it would have been the race music, the black music at the time, early soul, R&B. So you can't help having heard that stuff. And then when you wanted to pick up your guitar and be like that hero that you'd heard playing, you're going to incorporate all of that stuff in there. Now people talk about, oh, you were just copying the solos, you were just trying to play. Sure, that's how you start off. That's how you get your foundation. But the minute you start including your own artistry inside of there and you start exploring, even with chord progressions, and you're using old-fashioned chord progressions, but even as you sort of go, well, I'm going to bend this a little bit, I'm going to stretch this idea just a little bit further, that becomes your stuff. And that, I think, is where the rock is. Take a city like New Orleans, for example. In New Orleans, the early jazz musicians, the early musicians in that town, the slaves, the people who were the Creoles, who were the lighter-skinned people, who were sort of the mixture of the French who had settled there and the blacks, would have been listening to all kinds of stuff. Everything from French operetta to the courtly French dances like quadrilles and minuets and that kind of stuff, bagatelles, that kind of music. And they would have been incorporating that even into where they may have been playing. So you get somebody like Jelly Roll Morton, for example. They talk about early jazz musicians playing in brothels to entertain the gentlemen. Maybe the music started, that was when they were supposed to finish their time with the girls, and away they go. But incorporating music that was understood and then jazzing it up a little bit. Well, you know, that whole sense about jazzing stuff up a bit, you get a lot of that stuff happens in metal as well. Okay, so you've got musicians listening to that music. Musicologists will talk about a purity of it moving from the blues to rock music, and you know, country and westerns inside of there as well. And then from rock came rock and roll, and then from rock and roll, popular music, and so on. But that kind of negates a whole bunch of what we now nicely refer to as roots music. So roots Americana music, folk music, Appalachian sound, Cajun music, blues, early jazz, ragtime, Dixieland, all of that stuff inside. Imagine living in a place like New Orleans where that's your jambalaya, that's your pot of everything that you're listening to. You grow up listening to that. You can't help having that influence happen in the music that you do.
How did jazz influence the foundation of heavy metal?
Look at the makeup of the bands themselves. You have a drummer, you have a rhythm guitar player, lead guitar, lead singer, and maybe there's a keyboard player. Rarely horns in metal as much, but that would be your configuration. You look at early sort of what would be the juke joint bands or the jug bands in blues music, let's say. You would have the same configuration of performers, but you don't have, you might have added horns. So there's similarities in that way. You also have what's driving the music itself. So you have a strong rhythm section. And rhythm sections are, of course, the mainstay of jazz. That's what's moving the music along. This is what's happening in metal as well. And that sense that the band is supporting the lead singer is a big deal in jazz music, as it is in metal as well. So there are comparisons there. Incorporating music that was understood and then jazzing it up a little bit. Well, you know, that whole sense about jazzing stuff up a bit, you get a lot of that stuff happens in metal as well.
How did jazz influence hard rock?
So hard rock artists, for example, there are a couple of things. I mean, we've talked about swing drumming, which is a big deal, and you'll notice this with drummers. In the sort of classic rock, which would be in the hard rock realm as well, the drummers who are playing have learned certain techniques. Drumming, oddly enough, as wild and crazy as it appears to be, a skill, is a very rigid thing that you've got to learn. And the traditions of learning how to do that, to be a good percussionist, are coming from something that's been laid down over the ages. So that element's being pulled up from jazz. There are a lot of performers. I mean, the drummer for the Rolling Stones, for God's sake, was a jazz drummer as well, continues as a jazz drummer. There are reasons why those elements fit in both sets of music. One of them is the big importance of the rhythm section and keeping that that motion driving along as the music's going. The other thing about it is the structure of the music itself. In really good songwriting, you're talking about an A section, a B section, it's like the verse, the chorus, the bridge, and then the verse again, or however that might break down. That existed in jazz also. Play the tune, get the message out, then you bring up to virtuoso, they play a really cool solo that gets everybody turned on, and you go back and you explain the message again, end of the song, that's the tune. So these elements that I've been talking about, you're going to find them all the way from the beginning. They're in blues, they're in jazz, they're in rock and roll, they're in rock, they're in hard rock, they're in heavy metal that we were talking about. Anywhere that you're hearing stuff that's turning you on, there's a reason for that. It's coming from the earliest versions of that. It's like primordial music in some ways.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.